Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. So today I'm back to do one of my favourite annual traditions, which is to go through all of the historical fiction that I read this past year and tier rank them. In 2022 I feel like I had a really good historical fiction reading year. I think in years past I've read like in the teens or maybe early 20s in terms of the number of historical fiction books that I read. But I was looking back on this year and actually I read I think either 34 or 35. So definitely since I started doing BookTube, the most that I've ever read. I'm really delighted with that, and I think I've got a nice little mix here. And yeah, I think I'll just go in and start ranking these books. As always, I don't count rereads because otherwise my tier ranking would just be full of like The Mirror and the Light and over of my favourite books that I read over and over again. I do include myth retellings even though I don't include them on my historical fiction timeline video. If you can say that this book happened somehow in the past, then I'm including it. Even if it's Greek myth, even if it didn't actually happen. Those are all my clarifications out of the way. So I've got my handy dandy laptop here and hopefully my screen recording will work all fine. So the first book that I'm seeing on the tier ranking is The Last Days of Troy by Simon Armitage. It's a play focused on the last days that are covered in the Iliad. I remember really liking this one. It's not one though that has left an overwhelming impression. It's one that I would definitely recommend, but hasn't kind of burrowed into my heart. It's really funny. I do always love a bit of Trojan War, but I think I am just going to put this into the middle tier. Next we have Unequal Affections by Laura S. Ormiston. This is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice. In this particular case, it's one of my favourite books of the year, but I'm not going to put it into the top tier. I'm going to put it on the second to top just because I basically leave this one for anything that basically has become my personality because, you know, we all have those books. Really fantastic retelling. I really like the thought experiment that was going on here. Next up is Leah Wife by J.R. Thorpe. The more that I think about this one, the more disappointed I am in it because I love King Lear. It's my favourite of Shakespeare's plays, but I don't absolutely despise it. I'm probably going to put it on the second to bottom tier. I just didn't really like this characterisation, particularly of the characters that we know from King Lear. I thought this was a really good idea for a book focusing on Leah's wife, as the title suggests. But yeah, just left me a bit disappointed really. Then we have Romantic Mist of Bridgerton, which is the fourth book in the Bridgerton series. This is going straight to the top. I have reread and re-listened to this so many times. It's a really good pick-me-up book. It's definitely my favourite of the Bridgerton books. It's just so sweet and I'm very much looking forward to season 3 because this is the book that they're adapting. And then we have Angelica Frankenstein Makes Her Match by Sally Thorne. You know how I feel about this one. I hated this book. If you want my full thoughts on this one, then I will link the review video that I did down below. Hate it with the fire of 1,000 suns. Just so much manipulation going on here. It's a great idea, but just the execution was terrible. Then next up we have Galatea by Madeline Miller. I'm going to put this on the second to top. Not an absolute favourite, but was a really great retelling of the myth of Galatea and Pygmalion. I think I was especially primed to like this because I had just done a production of My Fair Lady, and My Fair Lady is based on Pygmalion. It's just such a short little story, but really does pack a punch. Then next we have Essex Dogs by Dan Jones. I did a full review of this one. This one is not my typical kind of read of historical fiction, but it is really well done, and that's why I'm kind of struggling with where to put this one, because in terms of like my personal enjoyment, I probably put it on the third layer, but in terms of like how good it is, it's probably more a fourth layer. And I am definitely wanting to read more from this series, so I'm probably going to put it bottom end of the second to top layer. Next up we have The Island of Missing Trees by Eilish Fack. This is one that I'm kind of hovering between the fourth and the third tier. Probably in terms of how good it is, it's a fourth one, but in terms of my personal enjoyment, it's probably a fourth tier. I'm not sure what to do with you. I'm probably going to put it on the fourth tier, to be honest. For me, it was nothing special. I can kind of understand why other people like it, but just not for me. Then we have Elektra by Jennifer Saint. I'm really surprised at how much I enjoyed this one because I didn't really like Ariadne that much, but I thought the characterizations in here were really good. I loved the different points of view, and I think that actually really helped for the pacing, which is what I found such an issue with in Ariadne. It's a retelling of the Trojan War again, but we're looking at the characters of Elektra, Cassandra, and Clytemnestra. And yeah, I thought this was really brilliant. Once again, I will link down my review of this below. The final revival of Opal and Neb by Dawnie Walton. This was shortlisted or longlisted. I can't remember how far it got for the Women's Prize for Fiction. This is kind of similar to Daisy Jones and the Six. It's recounting the story of Opal and Neb, a music act, how they got together and then fell apart, and all told through interviews. I thought this was really fantastic, but it's not one that's left an overwhelming impression on me, but I still have to give it like I'll put it towards the bottom of the top of the second tier. Still very good, definitely would recommend this one. Then we have Fanny by Rebecca F. John. This is a retelling of Les Miserables, but it's from the perspective of Fantine. with a bit of a twist. I was kind of disappointed by this one. I really wanted to love it, but there were definitely elements of this that I just didn't buy as such a big Les Mis fan. But you know, it is still Les Mis. I'm kind of hovering between third and fourth tier again. I don't know if just my love of Les Mis is making me want to put it like bottom of the third tier. I feel really bad though, because every time that I mention that I didn't like this so much, I think Char feels sad because she gave it to me for my birthday. I'm sorry, Char, I did appreciate it. Then next we have Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. Really enjoyed this one. This one's definitely going to the second tier. Do a bit of a switcheroo around here. Retelling the life of a female aviator living in the early 1900s who ended up going missing, and then decades later we're also following an actress who is assigned to play her in a film. It's just masterfully done. Then next up we have Beloved by Toni Morrison. I was reading this for the I Should Have Read That book club, and I remember that we all were kind of a bit on this. There were aspects of this that I thought were absolutely brilliant, but then the rest of the book I found just kind of dragged me down a bit. It's definitely a book that I think everybody should read, but in terms of my personal enjoyment, I am going to put it on the top of the second tier. Then next up we have A Lady's Guide to Fortune Hunting. I remember really enjoying this one. I had a very good time with it, though I will say it's not really stuck with me. I haven't heard many people talking about it, so I kind of want to give it a boost, but at the same time, I don't know, I feel like I have read better Regency romance. But it is really good. It is really good. I'm kind of hovering between second and third tier, so I am going to put it top of the third, but I kind of feel guilty because I did really like it. Ugh, we'll come back to that one. Then next we have Bronte's Mistress by Finola Austen. This one I think is going to go kind of mid tier. There were a lot of aspects of this that I enjoyed, but also just generally the character I found really grating and irritating. And I feel like she wasn't meant to be as irritating as I found her. I feel like she was meant to be sympathetic. We were meant to be on her side. And I just wasn't. I thought she was really irritatingly awful. But it's definitely an interesting book, definitely an interesting characterization of this woman. For those of you who don't know, this is, as the title suggests, it's focusing on the woman who was Branwell Bronte's mistress, or allegedly so, and trying to have a take on her life. But there isn't really that much in there if you are a Bronte fan, if you were wanting to get a deep dive into them. They're not really much of a feature, they're just kind of there for her to take advantage of and use as she pleases. So, didn't like her, but it was an interesting book. The Marriage Game by Alison Weir. This is going through the life of Elizabeth I, and particularly focusing on her romantic relationships and this big question of will she, won't she get married? Obviously, we know that she doesn't. This was the first Alison Weir fiction book that I'd read, and it's definitely the weakest of the ones I have read. I don't know how early on in fiction writing Alison Weir was with this, but this is definitely, it's so episodic, and it kind of feels like non-fiction, but with a bit of dialogue sprinkled in. It's very much like, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. But because it is Elizabeth I, I am still engaged. I feel like if it was a topic that I didn't know so much about, I probably would have been a bit bored and I wouldn't have continued. So I'm going to put this onto the fourth tier. I enjoyed it because it was Tudor, but I feel like had it been any other period, I wouldn't have liked it. The Children of Jocasta by Natalie Haynes. I read this in December. It's actually one that I haven't spoken about. And I don't know if I've got like time to really give a place to a lot of the books that I read in December, to be honest, which is a bit of a shame. But it was just such a busy month. This was really good, and I've seen kind of mixed reviews about this, particularly because of how much Natalie Haynes plays with and changes the mythology. But I thought it was really cleverly done, so I'm definitely going to put it on the second tier. A really interesting look into like propaganda and myth, or I should say myth making, and how much can we really trust what myths and playwrights say. When a Scot Ties the Knot by Tessa Dare. I don't care, do not care if you think I'm silly for this. This is going straight to the top. Love this book so much. Once again, read it, listened to it a billion times, and probably will go back to it a billion times more. I just find this so delightful. I've talked about it a lot of times. I'm not going to bore you with the synopsis, but it's brilliant. I love it. I love it so much. From such a great high to such a low. The Intoxicating Mr. Lavelle. Hate this book. Once again, hate with the fire of 1,000 suns. Next up, we have Pandora by Susan Stokes Chapman. I feel like my experience of actually reading this was kind of meh, but then I went to see her hosting a talk with Elodie Harper, who wrote The Wolf Den and The House of the Golden Door, and hearing her talk about Pandora was, for me, much more engaging than my actual experience of reading Pandora. So for me, this is definitely like a middle of the road book. I feel like I understand what she was doing, but I didn't really personally enjoy it. Once again, retelling of the myth of Pandora's jar. But instead of being set in antiquity, it's set in 18th century London. I think it's £17.99. The main character is probably the most interesting part of this. I feel like some of the actual playing with the myth is, I don't want to say sloppy, but for me it was a little undercooked. Then we get into the first of the 6 Tudor Queens books by Alison Weir. I feel like a lot of these are going to be placed kind of the same. First off, we have Catherine of Aragon. I love Catherine of Aragon, the figure, and I really enjoyed this book. This is definitely going to be second tier for me. Then we have Still Life by Sarah Winman. I didn't really like the first Sarah Winman book that I read, which was Tin Man. So I was really surprised when I enjoyed this so much. I'm definitely putting this second tier. Just this really lovely story, this found family headed up by this main character Ulysses, who ends up inheriting a house in Italy. It's told over multiple decades of him and this family kind of getting to know Italy, settling themselves down there, growing up, and it's just really gorgeous. Then next up we have Love and Fury by Samantha Silver. This is a retelling of the life of Mary Wollstonecraft. 2 timelines. We've got Mary Wollstonecraft going through her entire life from childhood to present day, and the reason that we're following this is because in the present day, she is in the process of giving birth to her second daughter, who will go on to be Mary Shelley. And while she's in labour, she's kind of talking to her daughter, not knowing that unfortunately she is not going to survive this childbirth. It was really beautiful. I'm probably going to put this top of my second tier. It is one of my favourite books of the year, but I kind of want to reserve my top tier for my absolute favourite of favourites, the things that I've been coming back to again and again. And as much as I do love Love and Fury, it's not one that I have felt the urge to go back and reread. Definitely makes me want to read more Mary Wollstonecraft, fictionalizations about her life, biographies, etc. And then we have the second book in the 6 Tudor Queen series, which is of course Anne Boleyn. This one, once again, is going to go straight into the second tier. Definitely not a favourite compared to Catherine of Aragon. I think that's because I do have such like a strong love of Anne Boleyn, and I'm kind of picky about depictions of her. It was definitely like a solid fictionalization of her life, but I had like tiny gripes with it. And also I feel like I much preferred like her story pre-meeting Henry. Then we have Jane Seymour. This one is going to go right to the top tier. This is my favourite of the 6 books. I love how it opened up Jane Seymour and her inner life. And I remember I was at a bus stop when I got to the end of this book, and I almost was crying at the bus stop. It was just so sad. If I have to pick one least favourite of the 6 books, it probably is Anna of Clever. And despite the fact that it is a least favourite, it's still a pretty good book to me. But a lot of the kind of issues I have with it are to do with the fictionalizations that Alison Weir chose to do to kind of like pad out the story of Anna of Clever. And I feel like it is one of those things that's going to alienate a lot of people who are already Tudor fans. You either have to kind of get on board with this fictionalization, this twist to the story that Alison Weir makes, or you're just not going to like it at all. I feel like I was able to like get on board with it, but it didn't mean that I enjoyed it, because this twist to the story takes up so much of the book that it was still a good book. But yeah, I did have issues, and those issues did niggle away at me the whole time. Then we have Kindred by Octavia E. Butler, right to the top of this pile. This is just such a good book, and it's just one that I think everyone should read. In the Shadow of Queens by Alison Weir. This takes the different short stories that she wrote alongside the 6 Tudor Queens, looking at characters who we didn't focus on, who we didn't get the perspectives of, going from the reigns of Catherine of Aragon all the way up to Catherine Parr. But also some of these stories are kind of like tangentially related to the Queens. You've got stories that are taking place in modern day, some that are taking place in the 19th century, that are related to the Queens but maybe not necessarily taking place in the Tudor court. And I think it's a really well done little short story collection, and I'm not a massive short story fan. So that is going to go into the second tier. Another clear second tier book for me is The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell. Another one that I read in December, and I'm annoyed now because I probably should have waited to read it this year, because I just don't think I'm going to have time to talk about this book. Looking at the life of Lucrezia de Medici, and particularly the mystery surrounding her death, her relationship to her family, and then later to her husband, who it is rumoured may have murdered her. This is a really interesting book. I probably would put it on the same kind of par as Hamnet in terms of a historical retelling. And I think maybe because I didn't know the history quite so well, I was even more compelled. But I don't know if I'm going to have a chance to really talk about this at length. The House with the Golden Door by Elodie Harper. This was the second book in the Wolf Den trilogy, and I think it was even better than the Wolf Den. Really loved getting this glimpse into Amara's life again. I'm probably going to put it ahead of Elektra. Move around Still Life, do a little bit of a shifty off some of these books, I think. There we go. Then we have The Viscount Who Loved Me, which is the second book in the Bridgerton series. Once again, a book that I think is going to go straight into the second tier. I really enjoyed this. I think after reading the first one and like loving it the whole way through, but having an issue with that chapter and that kind of pulling down the book. I was expecting to like the subsequent books as long as they didn't fall into the trap of doing something completely unhealthy with the relationship. As long as you don't make one of the two characters absolutely despicable in their actions, I was going to be on board, because I really liked the writing, I really liked the humour, the playfulness, the romance. And that definitely holds true for this book. It's definitely very different to season 2 of the show. They do make some changes in adaptation, but I really like this. And particularly in terms of looking at Anthony Bridgerton's character, I feel like the book actually does a lot better job than the show does. Not to knock anybody involved in the show, I do think the show is great, but I especially loved getting a chance to look at Kate and Anthony after they were married, which the show doesn't really dedicate much time to. A lot of the concerns towards the end of the book are Anthony not knowing how to behave as a husband, as an eventual father, and how his grief for his father fuels a lot of his decisions, and him having to come to terms with that. Then we have Catherine Parr from the Six Tudor Queens series. I would put this above Anne Boleyn in terms of enjoyment, but I think below Catherine of Aragon. Really enjoyed this, particularly really enjoyed the sections before she gets married to Henry, which takes up most of the book, and particularly looking at her second husband. I actually didn't want her second husband to die because I was enjoying him as a character so much. Then we have Catherine Howard. I think I'm basically doing this on par with how I ranked these in my original video. Yeah, I'm putting it top of the third tier, not because I didn't like it, but in terms of like the impact that it's had on me since reading it has not been as much as the other books have. Then we have Hunchback of Notre Dame, or Notre Dame de Paris by Victor Hugo. Yes, I'm including this, even though it's a classic, because it is still technically historical fiction. Victor Hugo was writing almost 400 years after the events that he was depicting, and therefore I'm including it as historical fiction. So there. This was a really, really interesting book, but I'm probably just gonna leave it on a third tier for me. I really like a lot of the discussion that can be had with this book, but in terms of like personal enjoyment, I don't know if I'm going to go back to it quite as often as I do Les Mis, but it is still very, very interesting as a book. Obviously, a lot darker than the Disney film. I don't think that's a bad thing. I just think it's something that you should kind of approach with caution in terms of its discussion on Notre Dame as a building, architecture and literature, historical preservation, which really wasn't much of a discussion at this point when Victor Hugo was writing. Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, but maybe not enjoyable per se. Then last up, we are finishing with a bang, The Language of Food by Annabel Abbs. One of my favourite books of this year. I have a real personal resonance with this one because of my BA dissertation, which was on cookbooks. And so I feel like I was always posed to like this, and then when I did, when it actually exceeded my expectations, I was so delighted. This tells the story of Eliza Acton coming to write her cookbook, but because she is not a cook herself, she has to hire help in the form of Anne Kirby, who is a working class woman. And basically we're exploring so many different themes, particularly looking at the 1830s, 1840s, and the treatment of women, treatment of mental health, poverty, as well as obviously talking about food. And the food writing in there is just beautiful, glorious. And yeah, I feel like I need to go back to this one at some point soon. But there we go, that is a rundown of the 35 books that I read that were historical fiction in the year 2022. Do let me know if you've read any of the books that I've spoken about today, any of your opinions on them. Do you agree, disagree with my rankings? Do let me know. And also I would love to hear any recommendations that you have for historical fiction. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.